John D. Rockefeller did not just build an oil empire. He engineered a framework that still shapes how modern society functions, from the way wealth concentrates to how institutions control information and opportunity. His rise began in an era when the American economy was chaotic and unregulated. Yet he approached business with a methodical precision that made competitors feel like they were trapped in a machine built by one man. He understood early that controlling a resource was not enough. Controlling the systems around that resource, transportation, pricing, credit, logistics, and public perception, was what created power. Standard Oil became the model for vertical integration. Pipelines, refineries, distribution routes, tank cars, and even the market language used in negotiations were standardized to Rockefeller's advantage. Competitors were not defeated by force, but by a structure that made refusing him economically irrational. As railroad companies fought for freight dominance, Rockefeller realized he could dictate terms by offering predictable volume in exchange for secret rebates. This transformed him from a customer into an invisible regulator of transportation economics. Once the railroads depended on Standard Oil shipments, they had no leverage. Through this dynamic, Rockefeller discovered a formula. If you control the bottleneck of an industry, you control the industry itself. From there, he built a quiet system of influence, using interlocking agreements and silent partnerships that allowed him to expand while avoiding scrutiny. His approach to finance was even more transformative. He recognized that the emerging banking class would become the real center of industrial power. So he built alliances that ensured his companies always had credit access during downturns while competitors were starved of liquidity. Banks found safety in lending to Rockefeller entities because they understood that his empire was designed to survive crises. This stability created trust, and trust evolved into preferential treatment. The result was a feedback loop. The more secure Standard Oil looked, the more capital it attracted. The more capital it attracted, the more secure and untouchable it became. Public opinion was another system he quietly captured. Rockefeller funded churches, universities, and public institutions, not simply out of philanthropy, but because he saw social credibility as a strategic asset. The more society associated his name with education and moral uplift, the more pushback against his business practices seemed like an attack on public good. When journalists investigated monopolistic behavior, he countered with community programs and charitable grants that reframed him as a benefactor rather than a monopolist. He understood that controlling narrative was as essential as controlling pipelines. His eventual shift into global philanthropy was not a retreat from power, but an evolution of it. By influencing medicine, public health, and educational foundations, he began shaping intellectual frameworks and cultural norms. In this new system, ideas themselves became resources to be refined and distributed. Scientific funding, medical licensing standards, and university research priorities were guided by foundations that carried his vision. He created mechanisms that outlived him, embedding his preferences into the institutions society considers objective. His personal influence faded, but the systems he built remained, operating automatically. As Rockefeller's direct control diminished, the architecture he designed grew more sophisticated. Standard Oil's breakup, often celebrated as a victory against monopoly power, inadvertently expanded his reach. By fragmenting the company into several major successors, each controlled by shareholders aligned with Rockefeller interests, the decision only multiplied his influence. These entities diversified, expanded overseas, and embedded themselves into global trade networks. The system became too dispersed to regulate and too essential to challenge. Instead of dismantling his power, the breakup decentralized it into a new structure that could no longer be traced back to a single point of origin. The philanthropic foundations he created became long-term engines of ideological influence. By funding medical schools, he helped standardize Western medical practice, which replaced local traditions with a centralized, institution-driven model. By shaping public health policy, he influenced how governments responded to disease, poverty, and population management. In education, curriculum reforms, and university endowments helped define what knowledge was considered legitimate. His foundations outlasted governments, recessions, and wars, operating with a level of continuity impossible for public institutions. This allowed them to shape priorities, vaccination efforts, agricultural reforms, scientific research across continents. The system no longer required Rockefeller's involvement. It functioned through bureaucracies, advisory boards, and grant-making networks that operated under the values he encoded. In finance, the consolidation of capital markets followed the same logic he pioneered. Corporations learned that controlling supply chains, credit access, and information streams created structural dominance. Investment banks adopted these strategies, reshaping global markets into interconnected networks where a small number of institutions held disproportionate power. The modern multinational corporation, spanning industries, influencing regulators, and operating above national boundaries, descends directly from Rockefeller's organizational principles. Even today, energy companies, pharmaceutical networks, and financial conglomerates rely on the model he built. Influence through infrastructure, resilience through scale, power through system design. Public relations, as an industry, also traces its roots to him. When public pressure reached its peak, Rockefeller turned to Ivy Lee, whose methods became the blueprint for modern PR strategy. The idea that corporate image could be engineered, that public sentiment could be guided, and that transparency could be selectively crafted began with the crisis management surrounding Standard Oil. Every modern press release, corporate social responsibility campaign, or strategic philanthropy initiative echoes that early experiment. Corporations today do not merely sell products. They construct narratives, align themselves with social causes, and cultivate emotional legitimacy, exactly as Rockefeller learned to do more than a century ago. What makes Rockefeller's system inescapable is not its visibility, but its subtlety. His legacy is embedded in the structure of everyday life, how industries consolidate, how governments regulate, how science is funded, how markets allocate resources, and how stories about power are framed. The world he shaped is one where influence flows through institutions rather than individuals, where ownership is distributed yet coordinated, and where systems guide decisions long after their creators are gone. In this sense, Rockefeller did not just build an empire. He designed a self-sustaining mechanism. The oil refineries may have changed, the banks may have merged, the foundations may have evolved, but the underlying architecture persists. It is a structure that rewards scale, centralizes influence, and ensures that those who understand its rules remain dominant. And that is the true legacy of John D. Rockefeller, a system powerful enough that escaping it no longer feels like an option.